I've got it.
Loud and clear.
You as well.
Sounds Gucci. Alrighty. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Talking TWAMPs. I am William Moore, your host, and we are going to be discussing publicly owned corporations, but specifically relating to infrastructure investments. So we'll see how this goes. It's been a major push of President Trump, especially on infrastructure. Before we get too far into it, though, let's go around the table and introduce ourselves, starting to my right.
Hello, everyone. This is Adam. I am guest starring again after my long absence. Yeah, that's me.
It's good to have you back, Adam. This is Blake, one of our slightly more frequent contributors.
And I am Joe.
Wow.
Good one.
All right.
I'm good. And I, once again, am William Moore, your host for the day, fresh off the boat from France. Not really fresh. It's been like a month. Okay,
did you actually come by boat?
No, I did not. That would have been exciting, though. Yeah. I did not come by boat, though.
I feel like sea travel's underrated these days.
It is. Apparently, you can get on some nice cruises transatlantic.
Well, yeah, when cruise companies move their ships from their Caribbean routes to their European routes, you can book a ticket, and it's super boring. But if you enjoy cruises, it's long and cheap.
It's like a week and a half of nothing. Alrighty, but we are discussing publicly owned corporations in the United States today, of which there are quite a few. There is a elaborate list that you can look up for yourself, but these include things like the CCC, the Credit Commodity Corporation, Farm Credit Banks, Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, combine the two. That was a good combo. Things like the National Endowment for Democracy. Did you realize that there? The
good organization.
Tennessee Valley Authority, and the U.S. Postal Service. But the one that is mostly related to infrastructure is Amtrak, or the National Railroad Passenger Corporation. That's its official name, apparently.
Pretty terribly boring name.
Well, it sounds like a government agency. What are you going to do?
It does sound like a government agency, doesn't it?
So, among other things, too, compared to some other developed countries, United States public transit, not so hot. What is everybody's opinion on, I guess, just starting off right there, specifically on Amtrak and what's wrong with it, or what is it doing right?
It's so sad. Amtrak is so sad, which honestly, I'm not going to lay necessarily at the feet of Amtrak itself. With the funding that they've received, they've actually created a decently, we all hear about the high-profile accidents, but all in all, it's a decently safe, pretty efficient system that has some administrative flaws, but again, with the money that they've received, could not have done terribly better. I really lay most of Amtrak's shortcomings at the foot of the federal government that essentially refuses to prioritize public transit.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think this is one of the few times where I think the problem is actually that you just need to throw more money at it. And that's true in very few cases, in my opinion. But I think Amtrak is one of those where they're just consistently terribly underfunded, and they can't compete with airlines because they just don't have the funds to do so.
To the Oppo researchers listening to this podcast, yes, you did just find the instance where candidate Adam did indeed advocate for throwing government money at the problem.
One and only time I think I can ever remember doing so.
I think it's true that Amtrak is underfunded, but I don't see that as the fundamental issue with it. I think there are two major problems. One is surface level, and one is more fundamental. The first is that, as far as I understand it, Amtrak owns almost no track. They may own some of the Northeast Corridor, but the vast majority of their track they have to lease from freight trains. And so this is where those 30-minute hour delays that we're all so familiar with come with when you get stuck behind a freight train.
The freight trains get right of way, and Amtrak never does.
Yeah, so I don't actually know what you would do about this because, as I understand it, the volume of passenger rail is not enough for it to be economical for the Amtrak to own the rails. You figure that's correct?
Well, Amtrak itself is not economical. Amtrak doesn't make money. It always loses money because there's not enough demand. However, the overall economic impact of Amtrak is greater than what the money we throw at it, in terms of jobs created and money made from people being able to transit cheaply up and down the Northeast Corridor. And so the problem is that Amtrak itself is not a profitable corporation.
And that's true of a lot of public transit, isn't it? I hear this about the DC Metro, that people are always complaining it can't make a profit, but the indirect consequences are much larger.
Yeah, and in fact, with metros like DC's, the indirect impact is so significant that even when it loses millions of dollars, there's just the local governments recognize there's absolutely no way they could survive tax-wise by shutting it down.
Absolutely. Well, also, one of the things I don't know this off the top of my head, but, Amtrak is losing money right now, but part of that is due to relatively low passenger volume, especially as compared to other countries that have incredibly well-developed rail networks. Amtrak doesn't actually haul that many people. Like, it does for the number of trains it runs, but it doesn't run that many trains.
Yeah.
And so I guess this would get back to my earlier comment, which I did not flesh out enough. My contention is that there hasn't been enough money poured into Amtrak over the years. And the reason that it doesn't carry enough people is because as a result of a lacking transport infrastructure, or one that at the very least favored road traffic, people developed other ways to get places. And then that meant that trains were no longer crucial to their transport. So I'm not saying that if we were to suddenly grant a blank check to Amtrak right now, that would, everybody would be like, wow, look at trains. Trains are good. But I'm saying that if we were to start prioritizing funding it and building, greater infrastructure, possibly to destinations that are poorly serviced by planes and roads or something to that effect, we might be able to reintroduce trains as a viable form of transport for at least portions of the country.
I totally agree. And there was I forget the article, but it was some article. It was like a scientific study on what modes of transportation are best for which distances. And there's actually like a graph in which a car would be best for like going to the grocery store or something. A bike would be going to like visiting your friend's house down the street. A train would be best for going say from DC to Philly or Philly to New York. And a plane would be best for going from like Philly to California.
Yeah, and I definitely would not advocate for like a vast expansion of Amtrak routes from DC to San Francisco like that. For a number of reasons.
What are you talking about? Amtrak needs to get on that Hyperloop.
Right.
Yeah. Well, if you get the Hyperloop to work, that'd be pretty sweet.
Yeah, that's an entirely different question.
Entirely different conversation.
But we spend not only monetarily, but also in terms of our impact on the environment. There is so much cost wrapped up in the amount of trucking that this country does, which I think was made easier by the necessary military infrastructure that we installed in the middle of our country, namely the highway system. But if we were instead to install, there's a reason why, traditionally it was the New York to Chicago route that carried like close to 50% of this country's goods at one point or another to be redistributed to the Midwest. It's way more efficient, just economically speaking, if you have the infrastructure to haul goods to a central distribution point and then truck it, rather than sending huge truck routes from New York to Chicago that same distance.
It's also the greenest form of transport too. Yeah. Trains are the least carbon output per like energy watt. I don't know what you'd call it, but yeah. Like distance traveled or something like that. So, but no, yeah. And I think another problem with the Amtrak infrastructure, with the rails and all of that, Amtrak is just like has a whole bunch of systemic problems as well. And that their new trains that they just ordered to replace the Acela trains that go between Washington and Boston. That's like their high speed. I'm making quotation marks with my fingers.
It's higher speed than regular Amtrak.
Yeah. It's higher speed than compared to regular Amtrak.
Largely because they don't stop. But
yeah, and then the problem is that those trains can have the capability to go faster than they do, but they can't due to the rail infrastructure because they built the tracks way back in the 1800s, the 1900s, when trains simply you couldn't fathom a train going 200 miles an hour. And so they're built curvy, and they go around mountains instead of going through the mountains. And so because of that, they have to slow down to 30 miles an hour when they're going around a turn, when most trains, other places, they've been built with the infrastructure to be able to sustain 200 mile an hour speeds. And so while these new trains that they have that are from Alstom, a French company, are coming in 2021, they can go up to 180 miles an hour, but they can't physically do so because of the infrastructure. They just fly off the rails.
And I contend that this is one of the biggest problems, not only with Amtrak, but with most public infrastructure, is just that we did it so early that in a lot of instances, we built pretty massive infrastructural and impressive infrastructural systems back in the 1800s, the early 1900s, but we didn't then get bombed like infinitely during a series of conflicts that required us to reset our infrastructure. And there's not been a huge incentive otherwise to put what would be an enormous amount of money into essentially rebuilding our rail system.
Well, the thing is, in a way, we did, didn't we? Except it wasn't Hitler and Mussolini who destroyed our infrastructure system. It was Henry Ford. I don't know about the national details. But in Cleveland, Ohio, which is what I'm most familiar with, there used to be an extremely extensive sort of light rail system which would allow you to get from the suburbs into the city. That was all torn up and replaced with roads. And here's the fundamental fact of the matter. I think even if you were to put money into upgrading these rails and these trains and such, America is very poorly built for train travel because our cities tend to be significantly less dense than they are in the rest of the world. The fact is, I'll use Cleveland as an example. Again, Cleveland had a beautiful train station back in those days when you could.
It was big and it was beautiful.
It was a big, beautiful train station back in those days.
Who am I channeling?
Because when they had these secondary systems, you could get there and you could use that to get to places in the city you needed to go. Nowadays, the Amtrak station in Cleveland does not even connect to the sidewalk. You must go in a car. I mean, you could walk on the road if you wanted, but you must use a car to get from the Amtrak station to anywhere else in the city. And I would argue that's probably the case in a lot of American cities. So it's a self-perpetuating problem. If you want to take a train somewhere, like, you're not going to the train station, right? You need to be able to get somewhere else. But that means the cities need to be significantly denser and you need to have ways around them. So I would argue if you want trains to be economical in any way, you need to start by focusing on smaller municipal systems so it makes sense to get from a central location like a train station to wherever it is you're actually going.
There's a good example of this that was a study done a while ago, specifically on London, actually, because around the 1960s, car culture was booming in the United Kingdom. So London ripped up all of its internal tram systems, and up before 1960, London had the most developed tram system in Europe, and it was used quite frequently. But cars came around, they ripped it all up. And now the train system in the United Kingdom has started to suffer as a result of it. So I think there's a good argument there to be made.
What's interesting, though, Joe, is that I'm wondering if we aren't already experiencing a little bit of an ideological pivot along those lines. Houston, which is perhaps one of the worst and most egregious examples of your sort of American city sprawl, just about 2 years ago started installing a massive tram system all the way out to its outer regions.
Really?
Largely because it has such a huge, impoverished community that simply cannot afford to own enough cars to make their transport across the city viable. And for those of you who don't know about city planning in Houston, that's because it doesn't exist. It takes like a solid 5 hours to cross the city. It's literally like miles and miles across. It might as well be several different cities at this point. But they have reached a critical point that European cities never did, which was instead of it being just the simple answer to a question, how do we efficiently get across our dense city? Oh, we set up a tram system. Now they're answering the much more difficult question, which is how do we get all of our distanced, impoverished communities to the jobs at the center of our city? So I'm wondering if we haven't hit sort of like a reverse on the back end of that circle of maybe now tram systems are becoming viable again. Maybe not in cities like New York or Philadelphia or DC, which stay dense enough that they have their own sort of underground systems, as inefficient as they are. But in some of the larger metropolitan areas that are beginning to answer questions that no cities really have had to answer, bar potentially Moscow.
Yeah, well, Prague, I think, is a really good example of this beautiful union of how the tram system and the metro system can work together, because in the public rail system, you can go from any city within the Czech Republic or Europe, for that matter. You can pull into the main train station in Prague, There's actually several, so you can pull into multiple of the main train stations in Prague, and you can hop on the metro, and then you can get off the metro, and then you can get on the tram, and you can get into within a 5-minute walk of wherever you're going from a different city just by public transport. It's incredible. And
this is where we begin our just supplicating to the feet of mainland Europe in public transit.
I hate to jump on what will be the very obvious bandwagon, but Prague is almost nothing compared to the Berlin system. I mean, if you have ever ridden the Berlin line, it's kind of actually insane how close you can get to your building without basically any effort, because it goes, and I'm not kidding you, international rail system to train station to tram system to underground it would go underground rail to tram system to bus to essentially your house. The fact that people own cars in Berlin is just a wealth status symbol. There is functionally no reason that you would ever have to do so.
And I tell you what, that public transit is the one thing that the Eastern Bloc really did better than anybody else. Blake, to get back to your point, you're right that there is some development going on now, and that's a positive thing. But I think there's a more fundamental issue there, which is that, like you said, in cities like Berlin and Prague, you can run bus lines which basically go to everybody's house. But you can't just slap a bus line down in an American suburb and expect it to work the same way. You need to actually build increased density. And there is not anywhere near the same amount of political will for that, because you have sort of almost bipartisan opposition to development. I read about this a lot, about op-eds about California and their housing problems, and you've got sort of this unholy unity between sort of conservative suburbanites who don't want development in areas that they own, and the far left DSA types who call anyone putting one brick on top of another gentrification, right? So until you overcome that sort of NIMBYism on one hand and violent reaction to development on principle, I'm not saying that there aren't areas in which gentrification and development is a bad thing, but on principle there are areas that need that. That's a very difficult political issue to overcome.
See, I wonder though if it's not. I mean, I will fully concede that density is a big problem for why we just as a country never developed or don't even currently have the feasibility to create such efficient systems like we see in Europe. But I think the case study for there being other oppositions, especially from car industries and things like that, is DC. DC, for a number of reasons, cannot expand, at least municipally, like other areas can. It has a fixed boundary that it has essentially grown to, and
now it's taking over the areas in the other states slowly but surely.
But even those are going to be governed by different municipalities, and as a result, have even the VRE have created their own sort of weird pseudo-functional public transport systems. But the Metro Rail, which really, I mean, it belongs to the 3 states, the 3 municipalities, including DC, in that area, but the DC really benefits the most from it. It is so poorly developed, even though there's a decent amount of density in that city. The red and orange and yellow lines service every 3 blocks in downtown. But as soon as you get to Anacostia, just across the river, or even upper northeast, there might only be 1 train station every mile or 2. And there's enough density there, and a lot of people who would really like to be able to access jobs in the more wealthy portions of the city. And they just never built that infrastructure. Even though it doesn't look entirely like a European city, it's definitely a little bit more suburbanized, but it could very well support a much greater infrastructure program.
DC is the most European city in America.
And that's really
strange.
sad.
Yeah, it's strange. Yeah.
Well, the interesting part is that DC is slowly pushing that way. It was relevant in Alexandria city politics because they're building a brand new train station for Metro in like one of our shopping district areas in Potomac Mills or Yards or whatever the crap. I can't remember which one exactly. They're building a new one there. It's actually like people are getting pissed off about it because they're like, they're raising our taxes by half a cent, and I'm like, it's half a cent.
This is the new is this in preparation for the new purple line that they're trying to put in?
No, it's going directly onto the blue line.
Gotcha.
I didn't know they were trying to put in a purple line.
Yeah, it's going to service only the Alexandria and Northern Virginia area. It's not even going to cross into DC. It's just going to connect the blue and orange lines because right now, or not the blue,
They're working to make like a ring system.
Basically, so that you can get across Northern Virginia without having to go into DC and come back out. That's the new idea.
Yeah, they've done something I think kind of similar, or they have a plan for it on the similar side with Maryland, which is a good idea because that's one of the biggest limitations.
So it's going to be like a ring line.
Yeah, exactly.
Did that have something to do with Amazon?
It probably does,
Yeah, it probably
actually, because you're probably going to have a lot more of the new Amazon employees living not in like Crystal City itself.
Oh, I was wrong. The purple line is actually going to service Maryland, so it's not a Virginia problem.
Okay. There are multiple proposals, it seems, which all use the purple line name.
Okay.
For the record, we're all looking at a map of the DC Metropolitan Transit System.
Yeah, there are several different proposals that I've heard about purple line extensions that would service either Maryland or Virginia. But that there's a real cry for this, even as Metro struggles with fixing its weak infrastructure. So I think I would contend, and this is going to be a bit of a hot take. But the reason,
Bury yourselves.
Yeah. But a lot of the European development of train systems was made possible by its city density, but also by the governments that were in place when they got installed. They were they were insulated governments. If they weren't monarchies, they tended to be slightly. I'm not trying to praise monarchy here. I'm just saying that there was a certain amount of insulation from populist ideology that they were able to basically say, yeah, you all are not going to like this, but we're basically going to tear your city up for like 10 years and we're going to put in a rail system. And it didn't really matter because people were going to be like, okay, that we don't have a say in this. Whereas, infrastructure is necessarily a long-term project. You cannot install a train system in the matter of a month. People are going to get mad at the fact that it's taking a long time. And voters don't like that. A lot of voters are not a fan of the fact that it's going to take, 10 years to make something happen. And we see that all the time, that even when we pull together the political will to make an infrastructure program like this happen, 5 years after it's begun, we get politicians crying out for, it's been wasteful, I can't imagine how much money's been sunk into this, we were promised it was never going to cost this much, shut it down. And all of that sunk cost just goes nowhere. Which is an economically stupid decision, but it's a politically amazing platform to run on because it looks like you're saving the government money. And that, I contend, among all other things, the city density makes it less viable, but ultimately it's our political willpower that makes it impossible.
Donald Trump has been talking a lot about, at least he used to be, I think he brought it up the other day, about doing a bipartisan infrastructure bill. Everyone has always talked about that. Yeah. So why do you think that's never happened, even though right now I think there's this considerable political will to get something done?
Well, because infrastructure is a beautiful buzzword. Like, if I want an infrastructure plan, says the president. I want a law and order program, says the president. I really enjoy, criminal justice reform, says the president. And every once in a while we get one or two omnibus bills that, like, theoretically does something. But ultimately, infrastructure is the hardest to pass because the infrastructure industries, like the people who build roads and rails and stuff, are doing fine. They make plenty of money. And they know that getting into bed with the government on a contract that long is almost financial suicide because there's a very real possibility that your business partner reneges on that contract. And you can sue the government all you want, but they're more than willing to pay out the nose rather than face re-election on what they see as a $7 billion waste.
It's a fair point.
It's tragic.
Alas.
Foiled again. So, I guess looking to the future of Amtrak, as well as just kind of, because this is just developed into a metropolitan transit system discussion as well.
It took an interesting turn.
Yeah, it's just like everybody in their, it's like everybody in their subroutes. Where is Amtrak going to go? Because President Trump has been talking a lot about wanting to do that. Now, granted, he's kind of dropped the ball a couple of times on like his infrastructure week where it wasn't about infrastructure. Let's be honest there.
It was about the fire truck. He got to sit in a fire truck. It was fun. He enjoyed it.
He enjoyed the fire truck.
I must have missed that. Huh.
You can't see. He sat in a fire truck and he honked the horn and he had a good time.
Oh, good. Excellent. I'm glad he did. So, yeah. So you know what's interesting, though, with trends with Amtrak? You normally see Amtrak ridership spike when gas prices go up. And it's almost like, historically, that's been a perfect relationship. Gas prices go up, Amtrak ridership goes up. Gas prices go down, Amtrak ridership goes down. However, even though gas prices are pretty darn low right now, still hovering around $2 on average, Amtrak ridership for the past couple of years has been going pretty steadily up. We have currently is the highest ridership Amtrak ever has had in the Northeast Corridor. So that's pretty fascinating that for some reason, people are just opting to take Amtrak instead of drive places or fly places. And usually it's on the Acela routes, and then just the regular Northeast Corridor routes. The rest of the country it's just not significantly dense enough to warrant taking Amtrak. You're not going to go from Kansas City to Sacramento. That's just not going to happen. So I think that's been a fascinating trend. And I think Blake pointed out that there's kind of like a change in mindset when it comes to developing metro systems and the tram systems. And so maybe that points to a broader, more public change in mindset. Like, hey, the train's not a half bad option. Maybe I'll just take that instead.
I would argue that the fundamental variable there is probably congestion. As everybody who has driven even from Washington down to Williamsburg knows, these highways that we built, while very nice, are not able to deal with the sheer number of people we have.
I think the important phrasing there is no longer able.
Yeah. And the fundamental fact of traffic is if you just building more roads will not solve that problem permanently. And so I think it's natural that train
Look at Los
ridership.
Angeles. It's mostly a parking lot.
Exactly. Los Angeles is an excellent example of urban hellscape, American style. And so, yeah, I think it's natural that alternative transport is on the up and up. And that's one very small speck of positivity that I see in the current trends, that people stuck in traffic will be more likely to be willing to see their city torn up, I hope.
So I think that the greatest hope in that vein that Amtrak might have is if the president were not to go to Congress first, but to go to the two partisan organizations of state governors. I think that ultimately what we're looking at here is a bit of a disconnect between the federal system that we have, the fact that the federal government runs Amtrak, but that when you get off the Amtrak train, you're in somebody's state. And if you want to go anywhere within that state, you're probably going to have to deal with a state system of some kind, which I think, again, is flavored a little bit with my experience with the Virginia and Maryland systems, that as soon as you get off an Amtrak train, you can either get in a car or you can get on a VRE train, which is Virginia's train system, which itself is not particularly well developed, but you get the gist. And I think that if there's a real partnership to be had here, it's between governors with highly densely populated states and the federal government. If they could work out a way to split federal funding and allocate some amount of state funding to make, if not citywide transit systems a possibility, then potentially statewide systems that would make citywide systems more viable, that would be the first step, is to go to the governors first.
It would slowly develop it out on the state level, which could be interesting. It would be very reminiscent of almost the European system, because you have the international trains, so to speak, that go from major city to major city, and then developed internal country trains, which could be very nice. And It would certainly work with American federalism. Okay, so we are running up on like the 30-ish minute mark here, so we can, Joe's running up on the 40-ish minute mark here, but it's like, we can move into kind of the last question, which is basically, where exactly do you see development of the U.S., system going? We've been talking a lot about trains, but is it possible that we just continue developing in roads? That certainly has a lot more political willpower to do it, because people like to say, I have my own car and I drive it places. For a lot of people, it's not financially viable, but, people like to have cars. It's kind of an American thing. We have cars. What do you want? Alternatively, new technologies are coming in. Things like Elon Musk has been talking about the Hyperloop as like a super fast way to go across the country. I'm not precisely sure how he plans to do that, but we'll see. He talks a big game. Anything's possible. Or maybe, we find air travel to be getting better and better. Recently, Boeing said they put in like a massive order for like one of the first reintroducing supersonic jets into its standard fleet. Or not Boeing, but manufacturing more supersonic jets. So where exactly is transit going in the United States? Oh, yeah, and true. Blake's reminding me of the wrap-up. So, and before we get into that, I guess, thank you for listening. This has been an episode of Talking TWAMPs that's on William & Mary's podcasting network. We hope that you will consider listening to other podcasts on the podcasting network, which can be found pretty much on any distribution platform that you like. Just search Podcasting Network at W&M, because that's how the search engine loves it. And we hope you'll give it a listen. There are plenty of good opportunities. So who would like to go first? What else am I forgetting? Oh, yeah. These opinions are editorial. So, don't blame Catherine Rowe or anybody else in the school administration if somebody goes off the rails at the last few seconds here.
Off the rails.
Hey. All right. Well, that kind of hurt a little bit.
Yeah, I love my bad puns.
Yeah. Well, I think I see transportation. I think there is a significant political will for sexy, techie solutions to things. There always is. And I think you mentioned Elon Musk, and as much as I hate to be a stereotype, I think he's probably, him or people like him are the way to go when it comes to fixing infrastructure, because both Democrats and Republicans can get behind him. Because he's the wealthy businessman that is super successful and knows what he's doing and has these really cool ideas for, solving problems the Republicans really like. He's also doing something that will benefit the green movement in the country, which the Democrats can get behind, and that he's trying to create solutions to the issue of gaseous cars, and he's solving that pretty well with Tesla, and he wants to with the Hyperloop. That would hopefully incentivize more riders on public transport things, and so I think that some people like Elon Musk and companies like that, I think, have a significant future.
This is a little unfair because I'm going to disclose some insider information that I have not been sharing.
Oh boy.
But I think, barring some sort of cooperative agreement like I talked about between the president and a system of governors, I think that the next major push in infrastructure, because I think Elon Musk has some pretty viable options, but I think technologically and cost-wise, they're so far out that we're at least 20 years out from them being even remotely viable on a public scale. Maybe for the ultra-rich, we could build a Hyperloop, but that's not going to happen for your everyday Joe. All right, just because your name is a figure of speech. I think that the next thing that we may yet see is an increase in, or a betterment of those shipping lines that the Amtrak trains run on. Because what we have also seen over the past few decades is a massive decrease in the number of people who want to drive shipping trucks. There is a huge worker shortage for shipment across America, because people have begun to realize, man, it kind of sucks driving for 14 hours and being away from your family constantly. So there's very little willpower for that system anymore, especially since the pay and the benefits are so low. So, unless those companies can find some sort of miracle solution to increase their workforce, I think what we may find is that they begin falling back on trains. Because when you only have to tell somebody that they need to drive from Chicago to Kansas City, because there's a distribution line that runs from the train station at Chicago to KC, it would be a lot easier to employ that person than the person that you've got to tell to drive from DC to Kansas City. And you understand that I'm just giving illustrative roots here, but it may yet be that we see, those tracks get straightened like Adam was talking about, there being a speed issue there, or a greater increase in rail networks, because I think those shipping companies are going to have to find ways to get their goods out to their consumers that they just cannot find people to drive anymore.
So I think that the development of increased rail is practically going to be inevitable. There are two fundamental factors which are pushing the development of America today. Firstly is that population is increasing, and the percentage of our population that lives in cities is increasing. And more importantly, the number of large cities is decreasing. So people are moving, for example, from Dayton, Ohio to Columbus, Ohio. You have a smaller number of larger cities. Number two, cars are not getting any smaller. And respect for Elon Musk for his electric cars and stuff, that's cool and all, but a Tesla takes up the same amount of room on the road as a Ford or whatever else. And I think congestion ultimately is going to be a much more fundamental issue than gas prices in the long term, especially in those large city centers. Electric cars are cool and all. Hyperloop is cool and all. But the fact is, the solutions to our problems already exist. Unfortunately, they're not so sexy. They're European. We don't like European ideas quite as much as we like Elon Musk. But really, I just have to say there's no other option. I think people will rather ride a train, and even if they have to, eat stroopwafel or something effete like that.
Waffles are good.
They are. But rather than sit in increasing amounts of traffic. So yeah, that's my take. Cars aren't so sexy if you're going 5 miles an hour in little spurts, which is what you get on the Beltway these days.
Very true. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you for listening to this episode of Talking TWAMPs. We hope you have a good one and hope to hear from you soon.